This is my 3D printer. There are many like it, but this one is mine. There are a lot of ways, however, that you can customize your 3D printer. This being the Quiet Craftsman. I installed a different main board with silent stepper drivers to help quiet things down. You can probably still hear the fans. That may be a project for another time. I also installed a BL Touch to help with bed leveling and sort of streamlining the process of getting going. But those are both practical in nature. What if I wanted to add something perhaps a little more decorative? Now, I do have something cooking on the bed right now, a little surprise for later, although I think the thumbnail and the title of the video have already betrayed me. But meanwhile, let's actually take a look at the back of the machine here. That little orange widget is something we call sort of a filament visualizer. It's pretty simple. It's just a telltale that shows which direction and at what speed that stepper motor is spinning. That stepper motor on this machine is a Bowden style machine, and it feeds filament through the tube and into the hot end. Being able to see that direction and speed can help diagnose a few things. It can show if you've missed some steps or if there's some retraction issue that you're trying to diagnose or fine-tune. That's a little bit above my understanding of the machine, but it is still an opportunity to add a little visual flair. Now, like I said on this machine, it's a Bowden style, which actually means the stepper motor remains in the back, fairly stationary, and spins like this. And do you know what else spins like this? Merry-go-rounds, which probably would have been a simpler project, but also lighthouses. Well, technically the building doesn't spin, but the light spins. Technically the light doesn't spin, but the lens spins. And it's something that goes like this. And I thought it would be interesting using the motion already inherent in the 3D printer to sort of have a animated decoration on mine. Now, before anyone asks, I haven't seen the movie The Lighthouse. It looked too scary. But instead, I'm basing my lighthouse on one from the movie Jaws, which takes place on Martha's Vineyard.
In Amity, you say yard.
On Martha's Vineyard.
They're in the yard, not too far from the car.
Now, there are 5 lighthouses on Martha's Vineyard, and in fact, I think in the background of the movie you can see all of them, but I've chosen the Edgartown Harbor Light to model my particular design after. You can actually see it in the background here with Quint aboard the Orca and the harbor lighthouse behind him. Now, I'm not a lighthouse expert, but it does seem that a lot of designs have a spinning lens and the light remains stationary. And for this small model, that's the way that we're going to do it too. So our LED light will be permanently attached to the very roof of our model lighthouse. This actually simplifies a couple of things. We don't necessarily have to have spinning electronics, and then the whole rest of the body will essentially be a decorative shell around which the mechanics will spin. Now, this will all be powered by that stepper motor down at the bottom, which again is the extruder stepper motor that feeds filament into the hot end. So as that spins, well, we'll actually build essentially a drive shaft which takes that spinning motion off of the stepper motor and spins all the way up. And on the top, if you can see, that's actually a little cup, and that works as a blinder. That'll have a couple of holes in that, and it will, as it spins, reveal the light. So it will look like the light is spinning, but in actuality, it's that cup with those holes in it that spins around the LED light. And again, this whole thing is powered by that stepper motor down at the bottom that the drive shaft attached to, while the lighthouse body and the LED light remain stationary. So I'm no expert on lighthouses, less so on the workings of Fusion 360. I do pretty basic design work, simple shapes and then sort of extruded into final shape. You can see I'm using a picture of the lighthouse here as reference, and then, just chunking it out. So I apologize if my atrocious workflow offends, but it gets me files to print, and you can see here the final product, as well as a base to actually attach it to the 3D printer when everything is done. All right, so it's the next day, although in a shallow attempt for continuity, I did wear the same t-shirt. These are the final prints here, and these are the 9 main components, although there's some very small pieces I have in a little box that I'll be talking about in just a little bit. Now, these over here, though, are my failures. Some of this was just getting the dimensions just right. This is a moving piece, and so some of the dimensions have to be, no slop, but not too much resistance, and really dialing those in meant some of the pieces I had to actually print 3 or 4 times. Another one was this, which is the little room with windows at the top that actually the light emanates from in a lighthouse, and getting that to have fairly clean window frames with not too much sort of distortion or stringing or things like that. That took a little bit of honing in to get on that. And then you have classic step-ons, which are little pieces that fall to the ground and then I step on. But we got there, and we're ready to actually assemble this, paint it, and then install it on our 3D printer. So I printed everything out of this black PLA, and I printed all of the details, or whatever I could, as separate prints to then be attached to the main body after the fact. I think this is a good way of adding detail that might have been lost had I tried to print these as part of the 3D printer, and then you can orient your prints to sort of get the best level of detail so that certain things are printing horizontally rather than vertically, and I think it does a good job of adding detail to a small print. These are then permanently fixed with a little bit of super glue, as to is the top room, which again, that's where the light lives in a lighthouse, and that ended up being a nice tight fit. In terms of electronics, I used just a 3mm 5-volt soft white bulb, which again, that's stationary, and that drive shaft spins around it. I then used a pin vise and a small drill bit to drill out a path for the wires for that LED so that they can exit at the bottom of the lighthouse. Now, I had a hard time soldering while I was filming, but I also had a hard time filming while I was soldering. So, the soldering looks like crap, but you can't see it anyway. So everything is right with the world, I think. Now, probably using pre-wired LEDs would have been easier to fit it under the roof, but I used what I had and I soldered some. Before painting or attaching it to the 3D printer, just one last check to make sure that the electronics are working. Now, my design's a little odd as it actually snaps onto the filament runout sensor. You can actually see some masking tape too that I used because the tolerances were not quite right, and that drive shaft going on. Now, I'm snaking the wires down through that base, and then the body of the lighthouse will then slot over the drive shaft. And I'm just making sure here that it's going through the hole at the very top of the lighthouse for that drive shaft to poke through and basically cover up the LED light, just exposing those couple of holes as it spins around. So most of it's sort of press on, and it all can be removed from the 3D printer if you want. Even though I have to take it back off to paint it, I was just too excited and wanted to see what this thing looked like lit up at night. So again, apologies for the shaky footage. That's the excitement. All right, day 3 on our little lighthouse build, which means it's the 3rd day of wearing the same t-shirt. I got it lighting up last night and spinning, and today we're gonna finally paint it. So on this lighthouse, this whole body here is white, with this part being black, along with the walkway being black and the roof being black. But I'm gonna use a gray primer just because when I'm putting that white on, White primer might be better, but gray primer allows that color to pop and I don't have to put on quite as many coats. So I'm using a gray primer, and it's actually Vallejo's United States Navy Light Ghost Gray, I think it is. It's what I have on hand while I'm working on a U.S. Navy destroyer project, so I figured why not use that as the primer. And then the white paint I used is golden, but it's not actually airbrush paint, so I just sort of forced it through, but I should have probably thinned it out a bit better than I did. So there's a little bit of splatter, and it took, a couple of coats to really get that white on there in a good, crisp way. I then hand painted some of the accents with black, so those are the doors and the windows, and then I remasked so that I could paint on just a little bit more black detail that had been covered by primer at an earlier portion, and I just used some cardboard bag that I cut and then taped on so that I could spray that black just on a couple of places. Now, I mentioned earlier in the video some very small details, and these are the supports for the walkway as well as the handrails. These are essentially printed as single layers that were on the print bed that I just sort of popped off and then glued in place with some tweezers. So pretty fiddly, but I think the walkway supports look pretty good. The way that the handrails were attached was a little hokey. I couldn't print, them as one piece, so they're glued together, and as opposed to being circular, they're segmented and just glued from one to the next. Alright, off screen I added a little matte varnish, and we're just about ready to go. If I was to change one thing about my design, the hand railing was definitely a bit of an annoyance to put on. And it's not super straight, although if you look head on, I think it does add just a little bit of detail, although I'm very happy with the supports that are underneath the walkway there. So now it's time for final assembly and getting this thing lit up. So as I mentioned, the light is in the top, and then those wires are fed through the lighthouse body. I drilled those holes, and now I'm just putting them through and then placing that light, and that's keyed into the shape of the top there so it doesn't spin, and then the roof goes on top. I didn't show the installation onto the 3D printer again, but here it is, and the first sort of lighting up of the lighthouse. Alright, Lighthouse is installed, and that concludes the first build on the Quiet Craftsman of this Edgartown Harbor Light lighthouse, seen in the background of the movie Jaws. There's a couple of things I would have liked to have done slightly differently. Specifically, the handrail I think ended up looking a little rough on the top of the lighthouse, but otherwise I think it came together pretty well. I think it's a nice amount of detail for a small model like this, and I think it looks pretty cool on this 3D printer. Moving forward, I did make a space for a switch here. I'd like to actually wire that in, as well as adding a little bit more robust of a power supply solution. Right now it's just kind of alligator clips to a 5-volt power supply, but I'd like it really to be pretty reliable and fire up every time I get a print going. Moving forward, in terms of other decorations, well, I'd like to actually continue this Jaws theme on the 3D printer and build the Orca, the boat seen in the foreground with the Edgartown Lighthouse in the background, and have that ride on the hot end of the 3D printer, that little carriage, so that you actually see a boat moving backwards and forward in front of the lighthouse here. In the meantime, I'm happy that my 3D printer is finally shipwreck free. So. Links to download the STL files for this project will be in the description below, although I'd like to say your mileage may vary. I haven't designed much before, and I think especially you'll have to do a little tinkering on the base, because my base is a little weird to fit over that run-out sensor. If you happen to watch this whole video, thank you very much for sticking around, and maybe consider checking out a video in the future. I've actually got one edited that I'll release in just a little bit. It's even more niche, but just getting started with this channel here, and I'd like to thank you.